Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ilya Tenev, and I am co-host of the Bulgarian political podcast called Conservatism. With me today is my friend and the other co-host of the podcast, Alexander Ivanchev. Hi, Alex.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Ilya. Hello, everyone.
Today, we have the pleasure to discuss the situation in Europe, our future, and also our past with Professor David Engels. Mr. Engels is a professor in Brussels and currently in Instytut Zachodni in Poznan, in Poland. He is author of loads of publications and books. Two of them were recently translated in Bulgarian, and maybe the most popular of them is What to Do. Hello, Professor, and thank you for accepting our invitation.
Hello, good evening, and thank you very much for the invitation. Looking forward to our discussion.
How are you? Where do we find you?
I'm fine. Just came back from a conference in Warsaw, back in my office, and looking forward to speak with you about the current state of Europe.
Nice, thank you. Professor Engels, first things first. Let's begin with the current situation in Europe. When we visit, for example, Berlin or Paris, Brussels, Munich, London, if you wish, etc., on the first look, everything seems fine. The facade looks good, great architecture, still interesting culture. It looks like a good place for living. But is it really that way? Because, on the other hand, the problems are starting to show. And Europe actually is in dire straits. Chaos is something usual, problems with domestic and organized crimes, and it looks like Europe and the European Union are in decline, in degradation. The gene pool also has been changed irreversibly, which usually is not a bad thing, but in this case, Europe is losing its culture and manners. Am I right that these problems are starting to rise and that Europe, and Western Europe in particular, is not that great place to live in anymore?
Yeah, I fear you are right with your assessment. And by the way, that is one of the reasons why I also left finally Belgium in order to emigrate to Poland with my family, because of many of the different items and elements you mentioned. You said many cities in Western Europe look fine, and indeed, if you go through the town center, perhaps of Berlin, of Paris, or London, so then you may still have that impression. But already, if you leave the few miles around the museums, around the administrative buildings, the main hotels, and so forth, it starts to show that Europe is not anymore what it once was. Already now, Japanese tourists start going through Paris with maps where very clearly it is shown to them which areas of the town center even they should not penetrate. And once you go outside of that, of course, everything is possible. I mean, Paris is one of the best examples. Once you leave the radius of a few hundred meters or a couple of kilometers around Notre Dame, then you are in a totally different reality. It's not France anymore. It's not Western civilization anymore. It is something very different. And the same goes, of course, also for many other cities like Marseille, like Brest, like Brussels, also, of course, like London, like Amsterdam, like many German towns also. So Europe is, of course, as you said, slowly losing its cultural identity, but not only its cultural identity. There's also an enormous economic crisis and a social polarization happening everywhere in Europe, because these fault lines we just spoke about, they are also parallel with other fault lines. You have now a very small minority or elite that is running basically the country, and then you have large masses of people, and ever large masses of people, unfortunately, who are impoverished, who are losing their jobs, who are losing also their moral sense of honor, of ethics, and so forth. And it's not only a question of gene pool or even of cultural identity. Of course, the fact that the main Leitkultur, as the Germans said, the leading culture, is not anymore Christian, middle class, white or European, whatever that means, and bourgeois in its feeling, but is now extremely mixed by many religions and ethnic groups and races and social strata and so forth, makes this situation and this society extremely unbalanced and inhomogeneous. And that is, of course, an enormous problem for Europe. But because we are now living at the very brink of disaster, you could say, essentially in France, for the moment, it is still the case that the state, thanks also to social spendings, thanks to some police presence, thanks to some last remnants of, let's say, of good manners or tradition, remains to be more or less stable. But in France, you would just need a small outwards crisis, and then this whole edifice could tumble down. Already, Emmanuel Macron, who is certainly not one whom we can accuse of right-wing conspiracy theories, is speaking very openly of the risk of an open civil war in France, and of course the conservatives are saying that for many years. And once France is tumbling down, then the rest of Europe, Germany included, will follow. So we are living now, at least in my sense, the last months or years of still a vague stability, but that will not last much longer, I fear. And what comes afterwards, who may know it?
Do you have an explanation about why the Western culture is in this collapse? All the problems that you just pointed, why did they actually happen? As a couple of decades ago, almost nobody would ever notice that anything is wrong. The arch enemy, the USSR, was defeated and fell apart, and it looked like we actually were living in the end of the history by Fukuyama.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would perhaps tend to contradict you when you say that 2 decades ago everyone still was convinced that things were fine.
Mhm.
That may have been the case, of course, for Central Europe, and obviously for Eastern Europe's impression of Western Europe. But if
Yes.
you were in France already 2 decades ago, people already knew that there were large problems. It's only that these things have evolved in an asymmetric way through Europe. So one of the points, which is obviously the loss of cultural identity, the loss of middle class, the loss of Christianity, the loss also of cultural identity, all that has happened in France already for a much longer time than, for example, in Germany. And very similarly, also, if we look at political speeches, we see that in the UK, where mass immigration is also something that started on a much larger scale, much earlier also than in Germany, for example, had very similar problems and was already discussing these issues since the 70s. At latest. So I would say that this crisis is a gradual crisis. Of course, you are right in saying that now, in quite a few years, some people, or let's say a larger majority or larger percentage of people has become aware that things were not running in the right way. But there have always been quite many people saying for many years, for many decades, that if we couldn't change things, they would continue like that. And this evolution, because you asked me for the questions of why, well, I would say there are two aspects to that question. On the one hand, there are the obvious explanations. I mean, for many decades, sometimes like in France, even centuries, we have had a decline of Christian identity that leads to also to materialism, to hedonism, to atheism, and thus also to a loss, of course, of a certain form of homogeneity and tradition. At the same time, also we have an economic evolution that leads to the destruction of the middle class. That too started already from a structural point of view a very long time. Migration is, of course, also something that is not fundamentally new. Then we have also this self-dissolution of democracy, and the fact that democracy is or has entered irretrievable links and bonds with the high economic and financial spheres, which leads to the gradual decredibilization of democracy. That too is a tendency we already see in the 19th century. So this many of these evolutions as we have them today have already been announced 100 years ago. As you may know, I'm quite interested in the works of the great German philosopher of history, Oswald Spengler. And Spengler, in his Decline of the West, which Untergang des Abendlandes, which he wrote already in 1917, announced in a very prophetic way most of the elements that we see today. So, for the people wanting to open their eyes, the trajectory of the evolution of the West was quite clear for a long time. So there are many different punctual factors. They go back a long time back in history, which is also why I have always some difficulties in trying to attributing them to single events or persons. Of course, there are people who have their own responsibility in that is sure. What is happening now is not happening innocently, and there are people benefiting massively from what is happening now, and that are pushing also the evolution because they know that this is going to their favor. But they are not necessarily the causes. The causes are situated much earlier. And as Spengler or Toynbee or many other philosophers have shown, all civilizations somehow are mortal. All civilizations have a limited duration, you could say, and all in the end are falling down along quite similar lines. And if you look at the fall of the classical Chinese civilization in the third century BC, if you look at the fall of the classical Greco-Roman civilization in the first century BC, if you look at the crisis of the Iranian world in the 6th, 7th century, and so forth through world history, you will see that everywhere we have quite similar factors that have happened time and again in the past and that are happening now again. So the question of why is thus very, very complex to answer. Even more, the question, of course, what can we do against this apparently unavoidable fate?
Professor, I know that this is a hard question, but do you think that these processes that you already told us about are irreversible? And are we witnesses of the end of the European civilization as we know it?
Yes to both questions. Unfortunately, that would
Wow.
be the short answer. The long answer is, of course, what do we mean with the end of a civilization? And unfortunately, many people think that the like Spengler's Decline out of the West, which we are living right now, would necessarily be something spectacular that would happen just in some few years, and then in the end there are only smoldering ruins and barbarians going over them. That's not how civilizations die. Civilizations die a long death. Sometimes it can even be a semi-peaceful death, at least at the beginning. So it's rather the fact that less and less people seem interested in the heart of the identity of a civilization. That more and more people are just thinking about their own fun, their own career, their own materialist and hedonist pleasures. That a common identity or the feeling of a common identity is shrinking, and that there are less and less people who want to defend this civilization. And as long as there is still some remnant of institutions, economic structures, and so forth, built by previous generation that is still running without a crisis, this situation can hold up quite some time, even with people as managers who are not that interested in maintaining that or going beyond maintaining that. But once there are exterior crises, most of these people are not resilient enough. They are not capable of fighting back, of improving, of defending. They'll just leave their post or say, we do not know how that functions. And so step by step, of course, things are happening as they are happening now. So the end of a civilization, I would say, is as unavoidable than our own death. We as human people are dead, are mortal. beings. We have to cope with that. We somehow do not want to believe it, but rationally we know that everything that lives must die. So why shouldn't civilizations also die, as they are human collective constructions? So for me, that seems quite logical, and as an idea, not so difficult to accept once you accept your own idea of death. So I would say yes, the West will die in a certain way. The West will also irremediably be vowed to that. But we have some liberty. We can decide how we want this slow death, or let's say petrification of our civilization to work out. We can deny it. We can say no, we are immortal. We can set ourselves absolutely crazy goals, like converting the entire globe to climate neutrality and to pretended allegedly human values, and spend all our very few forces on some crazy projects that will lead us very soon into the grave. Or, of course, we can be more conscious about what is happening. We can rather try to strengthen and defend what is left, strengthen our borders, strengthen our identity, concentrating our forces on at least securing access, for example, to natural resources, go back again to bind back our identity also to a transcendental belief in something higher, in order to fight also hedonism, materialism, and so forth, and try to unify Europe in a way that is at the same time, let's say, respectful for local, regional, national identities, but that would at least federalize to a certain extent what Europe, and the true Europe, not the European Union Europe, would need in order to survive. That is what I have called hesperialism. That is an ideology that combines a certain form of Western and European patriotism with a very clear and distinctive conservative outlook on what defines European identity and our culture and our tradition.
On this topic, are there some best practices to fight with that? Or maybe it is better to just save ourselves, our families, our friends, and to wait for the problems to pass? If yes, then what are these best practices to survive in these problematic times? And if we do as you said in what to do, to create societies in small villages, surround ourselves with signs of culture, with local products, habits, and arts, wouldn't that start a new era of tribe system? Also, what is the problem with the big cities?
Mhm, mhm. A very large question, of
Yes.
course, and it is not easy to respond in a single fashion, as the situation all over Europe is, of course, very differently. If you live as a single European somewhere in the middle of Paris, where there is a real risk of civil disorder, of chaos, of an oppressive transformation of the state into a more, let's say, authoritarian woke mechanism, then of course your answer is a bit different than if you are living, such as me, somewhere on the outskirts of a peaceful Polish town, with none of these problems as they are happening, for example, in France, being absolutely urgent. So there is not one answer for the entirety of Europe, obviously. But I would say there are different parameters we have to think about. First is that very obviously Western Europe will succumb to a grave period of civil disorder, civil unrest. May not be civil war in a classical military sense, but it could be, let's say, some form of generalized decline, combined with high criminality, with the disappearance of the state from most zones of the nation, of problems of being provided with basic features of daily life, of the rise of paramilitary or religious formations, chaos, that kind of thing that we already experience regularly in the past. So confronted with the high probability of such a situation, the obvious response, and that's the public for which I wrote also my book, Que faire, Bastoun, which has been published into Bulgarian now. The obvious answer to that would be, well, leave at least the big cities, go to the land, somewhere to the flat country, try to become as independent as possible from any other and outwards influence. Try to assure your access to basic commodities, bond with friends and family in order to form these small tribes, as you called them, as a form of parallel societies. Try to become as autarcical and as independent as possible, so that in the end, when a crisis arrives, you can survive more or less in them. Of course, there's much more to my book than just survivalist topoi, because they are also practiced, of course, by the left and by the ecologists. So in my book, of course, I go much further. I also say that we need to become more and more conscious of our cultural, but also our spiritual legacy. That we need to once again find an access to transcendence through Christianity. That we need to pass this over to our children, to pass them the love of our Western civilization, that we need also for our own sake leave the pure negativity of hating what is happening around us by again finding a connection to the beauty of our culture, to the beauty also of nature, to animals, to friendship, to love, that we need to stabilize our families and so forth. We need to create in small groups and there and exactly at the place where we are for the moment, some form of ideal ark, like, a bit like Noah's Ark, like some form of ideal conservative societies that can be an example to others, and that can be, of course, also resistant and resilient towards all forms of crisis. And I'm saying that the word resilient and example with a certain idea behind my mind, because this crisis that is coming now will not be eternal. People, at least after 20 years or so, will become fed up by insecurity, by criminality, by loss of identity, by the gradual paralysis of the institutions, by the absurdities of woke civilization and this curious combination between a billionaires regime on the one hand and socialist statecraft for the large masses. So they will look for any possibilities to recreate some form of stability, of identity, of peace, of order, of law, and so forth. And if I can say that, as conservatives, become examples, not only examples of a pure materialist efficiency, but also human examples where people can show up to, look up to, and say, indeed, they are living an ideal I could share, I could respect, that could give a hold to my life. Then there might be a possibility that these groups, if they manage to prosper, to grow, to control also some cities, and so could be an example in order to recreate some form of stabilities in 20 years. That would be my message, you could say, for Western Europe. Now, I know that in the East, the situation is partly different. The East will be touched, of course, also by economic crisis. If the West goes into decline, then countries like Bulgaria will not prosper even more so, but they will somehow also be turned into this situation. But the let's say the political and civil situation might be much more stable, and also their readiness in not voting for woke, governments, but resisting and still voting for conservative and patriotic governments, such as in Poland or Hungary, has been proven for years and years by now. And so I hope that during this period of crisis, the East could remain marginally more stable than the West, and that should the East continue also to remain loyal to their more traditional values, could then in turn influence the West, could be a help to the West, could be a help also to these conservative communities in the West, and could perhaps help reshaping and helping the West in going out of this decline and once again form some form of pan-European cooperation that would, of course, look quite differently from the current European Union, which is more or less the enemy, you could say, of true European identity.
Professor, if you allow, in your book, of course, which some even call the first practical handbook on how to lead the spiritual struggle as well as not just materialistic, as you said, which I think it's an excellent example of. But and we often in our humble podcast that you're now a guest of, we discuss the topic of what to do in the context, of course, of our quite dire reality. Our country is not going very well. There's no need to go into the very many details of that, but we discuss this, how to prosper better as a society, how to prosper better as humans. And we have one guest, quite a prominent and renowned Bulgarian professor. He's called Ivo Hristov, and he's quite an academic and very renowned in our country. And he came to our humble studio, and we asked him a question in the context of everything you say and what we struggle to find the answers of what to do, how to become a better country, better society, better humans, etc. And I asked him, should we not fight to get our own garden in a good state, and then try to think of the world, to save the world? How can you save somebody from drowning if you cannot swim yourself? And he said that no, actually, and on a later stage I agreed with him. He said, no, you must save yourself and the common too. And that comes, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you say to go into smaller villages, and of course we can save ourselves. We can make a wonderful, the professor in our studio, he called it, you can make a luxurious ghetto that works in absolute perfection. But he says, and I completely agree, your personal welfare is inevitably a function of the welfare of the common. So long story short, even if we save ourselves, make excellent villages, etc., villages, and we'll speak about your book later on as well on other aspects, but what you say, saving yourself in all the context that you said, quite contradicts what our guest and professor and I tend to agree with this. Let's say you make a perfect village of total luxury and perfection, but one day the hordes of whatever other less lucky people than you will inevitably come to steal your food. Let's put it in a very basic, practical aspect. But you cannot save your own self without thinking of the common. Is this so or not?
Yeah, well, I think both positions are presented in a bit caricatural way. So I wouldn't say that we need to found ghettoized societies where we exclude every other people and where we try to strive to some form of luxury and perfection. I think that we can already be happy if we barely survive with a minimum, let's say, of civilized standards during the next 20 years. So the message, of course, in the book is also not one of closing down, but to the contrary, trying to find people, trying to recruit people to help us, to join us, but under certain conditions, of course. And these conditions is an adherence to basic forms of conservative life, of a conservative identity, of a certain approach to what the family means, what work ethics means, what God means, what our Christian tradition means. That is, of course, the prerequisite for joining such communities. And such communities should also serve, as I said, as moral examples in order to help other people finding some form of identity and of hold. So it would not be about just hiding ourselves, but rather in forming resilient groups that could grow, explicitly grow, and that could do publicity, that could found also, that is very important, media outlets, that could form some form of patriotic but very efficient economic structures, that could form their schools also in order to help other people gaining the knowledge and also the identity they would need, joining and bonding also with church communities. So it's not about retraction, it's rather about expanding. And that means also, of course, not only that we need to leave all big cities, to the contrary, but that just leaves some margin, I would say, of appreciation to the individual. You may recall that one of the chapters also of my book towards the end is called that you need to choose your battlefield. So it is not one answer to everyone. I can fully understand if a family with 3 or 4 kids doesn't want to continue living in a crowded building as the last European somewhere in a French faubourg. This wouldn't necessarily make sense for them if they are not martyrs or fighters. So if they say, no, we want to have our children grow up in a correct environment and to form a society and to create new groups, we need to leave Paris. I think that is very clear. But on the other hand, if you have some young people who say, no, we want to stay, we want to fight, we want to show that there are still Europeans in such a big town, that we still want to defend our traditions, our ideals by remaining there, by founding group, by recruiting other people, then of course that's also an excellent solution. So there's not one answer for everyone, and I would absolutely join you in saying that we should not found the kind of gated American communities and just wait for others to arrive. We have to defend ourselves. We have to be resilient. We have to grow. We have to need to know how to build a society that can be quite robust, that can be resilient, that can survive, that can defend itself. But we have to also to understand that the notion you alluded to, that is the common, has disappeared. There is no common anymore, unfortunately. There was some form of, let's say, of common state, perhaps some decades ago. By now, it has vanished. Already now, this situation of a polarized, of a fragmented society that is only held together by the wish to gain as much tax money as possible from social spendings is already there. The immigrant parallel communities of African, of Maghrebian, sometimes even Asian descent, they're already there. They've understood that very well. They do not want, at least in large parts, they do not want to become Europeans. They do not want anymore to assimilate to Europe. They now want to defend their identity and to be as they are, while benefiting, of course, from the common. And then, of course, you have also other, you could say, parallel communities. I mean, the woke people, they are a parallel society par excellence. They have no form of sympathy or cohesion with conservatives. They defend only their own interest against also all the others. So I would say that the only people still clinging to this ideal of a typically 1970s kind of statehood are the conservatives. They're still somehow in their mind with the idea that a return to the good old 1970s or good old 1980s, where everyone was Christian, middle class, white, speaking one language, somehow all clinging or respecting a certain forms of tradition, that kind of state is somehow still there, and that we could bring it back. But it is too late. It is too late. It doesn't exist, and nobody's interested in that anymore. And so I just say that the conservatives should not become the martyr of a cause that doesn't exist anymore. As we said at the beginning, this is irreversible. France, for example, will never again be a Christian, white, middle class, well-educated, homogeneous society. That is over. It will never come back. It will get worse and worse and more fragmented, but not the other way. So fighting for something that doesn't exist anymore is I would say, not a good idea. We need rather to think about first how to survive what is coming now and what has been, of course, brought upon us by many of the wrong decisions of the last years and by the last decades. But we also have to think about the society we would like to construct, which I've tried to sketch in my book, such as Renovatio Europae, also just translated into Bulgarian, where I have tried to insist on the fact that yes, Europe will be fragmented. Yes, there will be many parallel societies. Conservatives will be one of them. But we have to work not upon now reconquering everything and imposing our 1980s perspective on everyone, but rather trying that a conservative light culture, that is some form of respect for Christian transcendence, for basic European values of decency, for a certain, let's say, a certain form of social interaction, of a certain cultural patriotism when it comes to loving our civilization, all the great and beautiful things it has created, a certain vision of what a citizenship means, a certain attachment also to rather democratic than oligarchical means of decision. That all that once again becomes a light culture, a leading culture that other people from perhaps other cultural backgrounds could also accept without losing their identity. I'm fully convinced that probably the long-term integration of Muslim minorities into a European state can work much better if this state is openly declaring its attachment to Christian traditions and values as the thing others have to define themselves towards and have to somehow to respect, than in a totally neutral, objective, or pseudo-objective, laicist state that basically enacts whatever any given majority at any given moment thinks adequate. That is the path towards disaster, whereas the path of defining our identity in a conservative way as leading culture, to which all others are welcome in different degrees, of course, of integration or assimilation, is the only path that on the long run can help us surviving.
If you allow me, of course, the society imagine you envisage it sounds attractive to me. I might even consider joining or participating in the co-creation of one of those. But would you not say it requires such levels of enlightenment and self-awareness and self-consciousness, which is it's not quite usual for the average person, for the average human being in our everyday life that we see around? Because, and I'm really sorry to say it, but probably this applies to pretty much all of us. The slightly older I get, and we all get, and we mature, you become slightly more cynical. And that cynicism makes you see that actually people are, on average, passive, non-proactive, unlikely to get and to crave enlightenment. And for all the things that you describe, including in your book, you need really enlightened people. And do we have those? Because the average human, by nature, not today only, but for centuries and millennia, has been passive. Do you think this is possible with the average human nature, which is rather passive than proactive?
Yeah, well, there are different answers to that. The first answer is that anyway, there is no alternative to what I sketched. The only alternative is, as you said, a certain form of cynicism or just letting it happen. That can, of course, not be the response of a Christian. So we do what we must, whatever the outcome. It's not just because a certain position, a certain morally good position, leads to something inadequate that we let it fall. So we need to defend our values. Point. If nobody's into it, even if we three would be the only people left in the entirety of Europe defending our values and still clinging to a Christian identity, to our great culture, then we have to do it. We can't just lose it. It's our duty, even if we die, even if we no success. Because as I would say, as Christian, as someone believing in transcendence, it doesn't matter anyway. As the success here and down is not really something that is so absolutely important of us. It is important for us to correspond to our own inner image of what is morally correct and what is our duty. So I would say mm, it matters not much as far as we do our duty. That's the first point. But I do not think that the situation is as hopeless as you describe it. First, I would say that this passivity of the masses you're describing, there's a leftist form of thought. That is what cultural Marxism wants to make us believe about history. That history has always been created by some evil people from the elite, the priests, the knights, kings, and that the large masses are somehow uneducated and exploited, but at the same time passive and do not react and so forth. But that's not true, historically speaking. Historically speaking, if you look at the past, you see that there have been many periods in world history where the so-called masses first were not masses anymore, because masses that supposes some form of anonymous crowd where people are basically all the same, not they do not really have an identity, they're just behaving in a collective fashion. Even the idea of the mass, the multitude, that's something that comes only from the 18th or rather 1970s. In the past, there were no things such as mass. There were different groups, there were classes, there were different forms of. I mean, you were defined in so many ways we have lost today, that people were extremely compartmented in different forms of identity, and they were interacting on that basis. They were defined by their jobs and their corporations. They were defined by the church they belonged to. They were very strongly defined by their village identity or by their town quarters. They were defined by the region they lived in. They were defined, of course, by their language. They were defined by their gender, as they say today. If you were male or female, they were defined by their age and the duties imposed to that. So people were much more, I would say, differentiated than indeed the proletarian masses that rose or were also created sometimes only in the late 19th century. And that is also why these people in the past were politically extremely active. If you look at the political fights already in the Middle Ages, even in small cities and small towns, if you look how people were willing to fight and to get killed for religious things without anyone behind them whipping them to death, but people who were openly seeking to defend their religion, people all wanting, for example, also to go to on the crusades to the east, simple people or people dying unfortunately in the religious wars. These people were not passive masses were just there suffering things, but they were active. You could say the same thing of course, of the Greco-Roman antiquity. One look into a history book of classical antiquity shows you that for centuries, all these people, even the humblest people in towns like Athens, like Thebes, like Sparta, like Corinth, they were all trying to fight for their ideals. They were there, they were voting, they were sometimes fighting by hands. And so they were not masses. So the mass is only created for not such a long time. And indeed, and you are right, what we have today um, are indeed masses of atomized people. They've lost their roots. They are indistinct. They are so over individualized that they become all the same. Because we all know, of course, that so-called diversity is extremely leveling and imposes more or less the same style to everyone, the same taste, and so forth. So today, indeed, we have an atomized mass, and that is part, as in antiquity, as in all the other cultures also, that is a symptom of the end of a high civilization. And that means that and that is, of course, on the one hand, a tragedy, as we want our civilization to survive, and people becoming again aware that they are actors of their own fate, of their own future, as in the past. But on the other hand, it can only also be some form of advantage, because yes, they are not overly interested in that fight, but that means also that they are not so overly interested in resisting anything. So they basically just repeat what the media says to them, which is why all these people are telling woke stuff today. But they do not necessarily believe in that. They just hear it in school, they hear it at the university, the radio, on internet. And they have some social pressure that makes it also more or less compelling for them to tell the same as their neighbor or their friends. And so they're repeating what they are told. But exactly that could change also, and that could change as quickly. In the Middle Ages, it was extremely difficult to convince a large part of the population of one idea. But now today, you just need a radio station, and you can do that. And once you control, of course, some media, some forms of mass communication, then you can change very quickly that situation. Even more so, as on the other side of the political spectrum, the enemy of the conservatives, that is this small, this wokist, leftist, liberal, green elite, is not much bigger than us. This is also a small elite. It's just that they control, as the Marxists would say, the means of production or the means of communication, and not we. But our enemy is not the 98% of the population, but it's also just 2 or 3%, just on the other side, you could say, of the political spectrum. So that gives, I would say, some form of hope for the future. Of course, we do not have to put our hopes too high. I said at the beginning, and I insist on that, all civilizations are mortal. Our is so too. So people will never become again, on a large scale basis, they will never become again devout Christians, really clinging to their religious identity, and wanting to join God and become one with Him, and to lead a virtuous life, and so forth. And they will never also in large masses become as in love of our Western identity and culture and so forth as we may be. So we do not have to wait for that. But I think it is still absolutely possible, should there be one day at the end of this crisis we spoke about, some form of regime change towards a more conservative regime as the only alternative, in order to install some basic level of law, order, identity, happiness, felicity, transcendence, and so forth. Then they could very well somehow stabilize that and impose at least some form of basic acceptance of our values that would be more or less the same as their today's acceptance of left-hand values. And that would create, of course, a framework that would make it also possible for young people to find their path towards the love of God, the love of the family, and the love of our great European civilization in a much easier way than it is today. So I wouldn't be that pessimist. But once again, in order to do that, just to be sure, to respond also to what you said in your last question, uh, we cannot limit ourselves just in waiting and just resisting. We need indeed to be proactive. We need to be an example. We need to expand. We need to have the means of defending ourselves also in a very concrete way. So all that is something we need to construct. We are only a small majority now, but people are watching us, and the growing hate and violence with which conservative alternatives are persecuted for the moment all over Western Europe is a sign that we are being taken quite seriously by the enemy, and that is somehow also a good sign, even if it is sometimes very difficult to live under such conditions.
Yes, to further up this last topic we discussed, and yes, I completely agree with you. We also in our podcast we do this with my friend Ilya and Krasya, who is behind the camera. We constantly think of, obviously we need to be good examples ourselves, and then that's the very starting point, obviously. But still, I'm slightly biased, and forgive my slight cynicism as well. And I'll link this up to something else I wanted to speak to you about. And I'm opening your book, and one of the chapters is, let's put it in other words, abandonment of the state mechanism. It's I translate from Bulgarian, but that's what it says. And in brief, if I would like to challenge you here a little bit. Which state mechanism exactly? Because I'm still a believer in the nation state, but I think, and I would like to link this in our podcast, we have a program on Christian Orthodox life. And we interviewed a bishop, a prominent Bulgarian bishop, and we asked him, one of the questions was, do you think that Orthodox faith in that case, but Christianity in general, has a place in the secular, in the nation state? And in brief, he said, look, who does not want a state in which the humans are born and bred and brought up with the thought of think of thy neighbor, think of your neighbor first, so don't be selfish, look after your neighbor, think of others, do not self-enrich yourself at the expense of others, etc. Now, imagine a nation state built up on those foundations. I don't think that's a bad nation state to start with. So would you say abandonment of the nation state as a concept, or of today's nation state? Because the nation state I described, the Christian-based values where the family is the cell, where you think of the others, etc. I don't think that's a bad nation state. So would you say
Mhm.
abandonment of the nation state altogether, or abandonment of the nation state of today?
Of course, of the nation state of today, for the moment. The, you shouldn't forget that the book has been written essentially from a French perspective. That was the first audience, as it was obviously written by me in French at the beginning. So that was the target audience, and I tried in the introduction to the Bulgarian translation to somehow um, try to show to the Bulgarian reader how he should more or less interpret my book, so that he wouldn't refer it one to one to the situation in Bulgaria, which I scarcely know, I have to admit. The problems is, well, there are two elements to that. On the one hand, the short answer would be that a nation state, how you described it, that is still founded on Christian values, that is founded on a respect of true family and not of gender ideology and so forth, that is also constructed around the specific interest and the defense also of the identity of its people and so forth, obviously is a good thing. That is the core cell, you could say, of our democracy for quite a long time. That is something that needs to be defended. But this model has disappeared in Western Europe. It doesn't exist anymore. Essentially in France, of course, there is still some form of state, like in France, but also in Germany. But this state is fundamentally rigged against the conservatives. You could say that this state is a partial state. It is not an open state. All its institutions are by now dominated by leftist liberal elites, and even those parties calling themselves Christian Democrats or Republicans or so forth would have been considered some years ago as being center left. It's certainly not middle or center right. So these situations are these states and societies are only open, diverse, democratic, and so forth in appearance. Indeed, they are absolutely left, and everything is done for the fact that they remain left. And this state is now used as an instrument against also conservative interests. So the state is actually fighting the family. It is openly fighting any form of traditional Christianity. It's only defending some form of leftist woke Christianity, as we know that, of course, in Germany. It is actively undermining its very core, that is some form of positive relation to one's own national or even regional identity through migration. It is actively also delegating powers to international institutions and elite. It is actively selling out all its industrial economic patrimony to other states, essentially to Asia, and so forth. And that is why I say that conservatives, especially in France, and especially, of course, of a certain generation, it's not the young people I'm talking to when I speak about that, that people need to understand that this state is not anymore their friend. It is not anymore something they can find a place in. And in France, unfortunately, with the decline of Christianity that was brought upon by the French Revolution and all the subsequent events in the 19th century, this state, this society has become extremely anti-Christian, and there, even in certain conservative milieus, there's a certain form of idealization of the state as the only thing that is left somehow of the old society that has imposed itself. There are many people who think about themselves as being conservative, and they just want to defend la République, but they do not understand anymore that this Republic has become indeed and in fact their enemy, and that reconquering this republic is not a thing that you can just do with by one election. If you look at France, at the US, for example, Donald Trump had 4 years to somehow reform the US society, defend the border, impose again some form of decent respect for the family, and so forth. But we have all seen how during these 4 years, the media, the academia, the deep state, the bureaucracy, and so forth has fought him, so that in the end, the result was not so impressive. So that shows that even if in France, for example, if we would assume that there would be one changing of government, well, it wouldn't change so much, and probably would also just lead to some form of disaster or paralysis, or who knows, huge economic crisis, and not bring or bring so many evolutions. That is why I say, essentially, to a French public, they need to think about the state as it is for the moment, not as their friend, but for the moment as an instrument of their enemy. Of course, they need to try to reconquer it. I'm not advertising to just let down any form of election and do not participate in them or found political parties or so forth. To the contrary, but they need a changing of mind. They need to think about the state as something that has fallen totally into the hand of an enemy, and this enemy will not just give it back like this. It is something that needs to be reconquered, and that takes time. And during that time, trying to function through that state and by the means of that state in order to reconquer it again is a bit naive. I mean, I know that all these examples are perhaps not absolutely correct, but if you would have tried through democratic means and through the institutions of the Soviet Union in the 60s or 50s to somehow bring a spontaneous change of government and reimpose a free, democratic, liberal, Christian Orthodox society in the Soviet Union by just presenting yourself basically to the elections and trying to distribute some things, even if that would have been allowed by the constitution, you would probably have quite nasty experiences. We are not yet there, of course, and our situation is a bit different, and the means of power of the elite are also different. But we need to think that working only through the means of that state in order to get this state back and to reshape society in a conservative way is extremely difficult, and that we need to construct alternatives during that time. So the second type, that will be much shorter, of course, is an answer. You said, you spoke about, is what about the model of the nation state? So the nation state had a sense when there was still a nation. Now the nation has been basically destroyed in most parts of Western Europe. There is no more French nation like that. And there will certainly not be a true French nation in 15 years or so. There are different groups. Some consider themselves as French, others certainly not. And even those thinking of themselves as French have extremely different views on what this is. And so this fragmentation of society will not just go away. It will stay. It is there with all these people also who are living here, who need to be integrated somehow. But the old classical model of the nation state, that is one religion, one language, one ethnic, whatever, common background, or at least a long history of living together on the same territory, one shared culture, doesn't exist anymore. It will exist less and less. On the other hand, we have, of course, this enormous Americanization of our society, and we have, together with all the many problems we are facing now, shrinking demography and economic polarization and asymmetrical wars and globalization and so forth, many problems everywhere. And essentially, of course, the rise of China and this enormous competition, that we are just at the brink of this competition of the new multipolar world. And that is why I believe that the nation state as such, as the only hope of assuring the survival of the Western civilization, is certainly not enough. We need to work together as Europeans, and even when fighting the European Union, we need to develop an alternative model in order to defend ourselves. We cannot, someone in Germany cannot just say, well, I will leave the Greeks alone with their border defense. Someone who lives in France can't just say, well, I'm not interested in defending Poland or the Baltic countries against a potential Russian aggression. Um, and so forth. So there are many examples where it is obvious that we need to work together. Someone in Spain cannot just say, well, I don't care if the last remnants of the European automobile industry from Germany or France are just delivered like that to the Chinese. He also needs to think that this focuses, this touches himself, and that a decline of Germany or France and their means of production will also automatically backfire on his own dependency from China. So we have many shared interests, and we somehow need to federalize at least the main ones that are fundamental for the survival of our civilization, of our true European civilization, in order to defend ourselves. And that means, of course, that indeed a return to the nation state as we knew it in the 19th century, at a time when there were much less nations, when these were much more powerful, demographically, politically, militarily, technologically, a return to that model that doesn't exist anymore today would be a problem. So that is why I am in some form an advocate of alternative forms of strong European federation, for example.
Professor Engels, at the end of our conversation, I want to take you back to the war against Christianity, as we mentioned it a couple of times. The Christianity was a column of the Europe civilization for ages, actually for thousands of years. Lately, it is kicked away with accusations for old fashioned, for not up to date. The Christian culture is removed from the books, concerts with some hypocritical explanation for the respect for all religions. And that de facto is a war. It's a war against the Christianity. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the so-called European elites should know that one of the easiest way to conquer a society is to depersonalize it. So maybe this war is led outside Europe. Who benefits from that? Who has a profit from the end of the European civilization as we know it? Or maybe I'm not right, and the main problem is within the borders of Europe, maybe the leftists that you mentioned?
Mhm. Yeah, that leads us indeed back to the beginning of our discussion. Who benefits from the crime somehow? And once again, I repeat what I said at the beginning. There are two levels to that. On the one hand, there are some people who are indeed benefiting from that. We can come to that back later. But on the other hand, things like that happen in all civilizations. So we need to fight against those responsible for our decline, but that decline is inevitable anyway. So it's not just if we could fight against these different agents of our dissolution that suddenly European Union could become, or European civilization could become immortal. Exactly like a human body can also fight against a whole series of sicknesses and illnesses and problems, and avoid things and so forth, and live somewhat longer than if not. But in the end, age is programmed into our system together with death. So nobody is responsible for death. And we always say, well, someone is dying from cancer or from heart failure or something like that, and this is indeed the occasion of his death. But in the end, uh, that someone who is 100 years or 110 years or 90 years or whatever is dying doesn't come as a huge surprise, but would happen sooner or later. So with that being said, indeed there are people who are benefiting from that. But again, the decline of organized traditional religion, social polarization with a tiny elite and large masses, and the disappearance of the middle classes, the establishment of a more oligarchic than a democratic or republican system, globalization with all that means, of course, also as benefits to certain small elites. All that are things we also see, as I showed in one of my books, during the late Roman Republic and in many other civilizations. So concretely, of course, for the moment, the main people benefiting from that situation is, you could say, the elite of big data, big money, big pharma, the weapon industries, big states, and so forth. This small elite that really dominates our forms of politics. Of course, we know that there is still democracy, there are still governments, there are parliaments, there are elected prime ministers, and some of them may even try to do a great job and so forth. But we have seen even during the last month that someone like Elon Musk or Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or many other people are much more powerful as such than, for example, the democratically elected leader of most European countries. So the true power nowadays doesn't reside anymore with democracy, but it resides elsewhere. There are elites, they exist, they have incredible amounts of money, and of course, they benefit from certain crises. So if society is not as homogeneous as before, if the middle class is disappearing and cannot defend itself, if instead of a virtuous Christian society we have a hedonist, materialist consumer culture, if democracies are more and more destabilized and paralyzed, uh, um, then there is, of course, also much more leeway for non-elected elites. So obviously, there are people for the moment who benefit enormously from that crisis. They are partly also responsible for that, but they are not. But they are exactly as the crisis itself. They are a symptom, because we had them in all the other civilizations too. And that is perhaps an interesting thought for the end of our discussion. um, oligarchies are never stable forms of government. So for the moment, as we are in this transformation phase from, let's say, where still some remnants of middle class exist, where there's still some form of democratic resistance, where there's still some last traditions surviving, they work more or less together or hand in hand in order to accumulate even more power. But once this transformation is achieved, once the great reset is achieved, we will not be in a situation of stability. Of course, we will have large masses that are atomized, that are fighting each other, and that are dominated by a small elite. But everyone in that elite, sooner or later, will want to have total power. They do not want to share it. And so they will start to fight themselves. Already now we see with all these competences and mergers and the fight of Musk, for example, against Twitter or things like that, that this is already starting by now. And it will become more and more obvious in the future. And of course, it will also be fought in a political way, because I'm quite convinced that these oligarchs, they will also try to actively try to find a political followership, because they will sooner or later be more or less on a level of equality, and so they will need to activate these disenfranchised and anonymized masses for them. So there will be a certain politicization of their fight, which for the moment is only an economic fight. So there might be some form of re-ideologization of politics through these oligarchies, and that could be, of course, also a chance for us. Think only about, I mean, I'm not a fan of Elon Musk, but if you think, for example, about some of his tweets about the freedom of speech, about some criticism of woke culture, some form of support for the Republican Party in the US, you see already that there is some form of politicization of these people happening. And so in the end, there could be one or the other of these enormous big players that are collectively responsible for the decline of our civilization, that could then also, because of their wish for power, be responsible for some form of stabilization and perhaps even conservative stabilization of power. Already someone like Donald Trump is an example of someone who comes from the economy, who is certainly not, let's say, not innocent of a certain form of social polarization also in the US, but who still, as a politician, tries to defend certain ideals we as conservatives might find clearly more sympathetic than what his adversaries do. So I think this evolution will become more and more pronounced in the next 20 years. And who knows, in the end, perhaps one of these oligarchs, even if they are, as I said, responsible for the crisis of democracy, could become perhaps one of the defenders of at least certain conservative ideals and help us somehow also defending them, and perhaps once again putting them into a place of political decisions. Who knows? That is at least how things went in the late Roman Republic, as I've shown in my book on the subjects, where key players such as Crassus or Pompey or Cicero, who were also extremely wealthy people, also were active in politics. And so, in the end, it is through the support of big money and also big forms of economy and influence for Augustus that the Roman civil wars in the end were ended, and how through the support of the Roman bank system, finally Augustus managed to come to power, to end the civil wars, and to impose some form of conservative restoration of the Roman Republic. Of course, we all know that from the point of view of the 3rd century BC, that this republic was just some form of scam, and indeed it was a more authoritarian regime with a republican facade. But the alternative in that case would have meant endless civil wars, or the power of a senatorial oligarchy that was hated by all the Romans and that was just known for exploiting the people and imposing its chaos everywhere. So this could be a somewhat dystopian perspective, but I think quite realistic scenario that we may face in 20 years too.
Professor Engels, that is a great way to end up our conversation. Last question. In Conservite, we love reading, so could you please recommend us and our viewers, of course, a book or books that could be useful for us, except your two, of course, that are already translated in Bulgarian. We will recommend them for you.
Well, perhaps my answer will not amaze you or surprise you overly, but Tolkien, of course. Tolkien's writing are, at least for me, one of my major accesses to what conservatism means, to the transcendent perspective of conservative, to the true values of conservative, of people who are defining themselves not by simple matter and hedonism and so forth, but by the existing of something that is far superior to their own, and that defend values that are also our own, and that people who also create an enormous form of beauty and aesthetics in their life, and that combine, of course, their own strive for some form of happiness and virtue with the search for beauty, as it is expressed everywhere in the people designed by Tolkien. So this is, for me at least, the best way or the best materialization of how I would see a conservative author and a conservative society. And I could now speak for hours and hours about Tolkien, but I think that we can leave that for another time. But Tolkien is absolutely, from my point of view, the conservative reader to read in order to again gain hope in humanity, hope in what lies beyond, hope in our own, and to show us, as I said some minutes ago, that we have to do our duty, whatever it takes, and without any regard for a positive or negative outcome. That is everything we can do, and we have to pursue that duty until the end, even if it is our own end.
Professor, thank you again for accepting our invitation for this great conversation, and it was a pleasure for us.
For me too. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. If you like what we do subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are from Bulgaria. We have other podcasts as well in English, so you can scroll through our podcast. If you like what we do, give us a like or just subscribe to our channel.
Уважаеми зрители, ние сме консервите, докато дишаме, ще продължим да търсим отговори, ще продължим да сме непокорни и ще милеем за България. Благодарим ви.